Yes, this week, Final Fantasy 16 received a patch which introduced a number of additions and tweakables, specifically to address concerns about the 30 FPS mode working in operation with the motion blur, which wasn't configurable at launch. Lots of people not happy about that. John did our coverage for that. John, you've looked at the patch.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think of it?
Well, I mean, this is a feature that should have been there from day one, I think. Clearly, a lot of people were not fans of the motion blur, which I am, but that's okay. They've added a slider now, and the slider has 5 different settings from 0 to 5. 5 being the default, like the original game, and then 0 is no motion blur, which I think looks pretty horrible, to be honest. It makes the game look a lot less nice in motion. But thankfully, there is now a middle ground, and I suggest that anybody that was a little bit off-put by the motion blur might try a setting of 3, because I think that still looks pretty good. You get the effect of it, but it's much less intense, and it should hopefully be more tolerable for folks, and it's more in line with the kind of shutter speed you see in a lot of other games, so that's worth a shot. But they added other stuff as well, including the follow camera adjustments. So by default, the game sort of tries to keep the camera centered on the player as you run around the world, so it does wrestle control away. I actually don't mind this. I think it feels good because for character action, that's kind of what I wanted. But, you know, obviously a lot of folks want to be able to look around with the camera with the right stick, and it kind of fights you by default. Now with this feature, you can toggle follow camera for different settings. For instance, in combat versus just exploration, versus, I think there's a third one as well, but this allows you to freely move the right stick as you move your player around the screen without the game taking over control of the camera. So between these two things, I think this should solve most of the issues that people had in terms of just moving around the game world. Reduced blur, no more follow camera. That's nice. But I also saw comments from people saying, John, they took out that fast loading feature when you continue from the OS level, and now there's logos again. And I wanted to clarify that because I tested it as well, and they are not there. It works exactly as it did before, but like every other PS5 game that has this option, when you install a new patch, the first time you run it after the patch, you will get the logos. But there's actually another trick here. There's another wrinkle, if you will. If you load the game, you get the logos, it goes to the main menu, and then you quit the game without actually loading a save, and then you reload the game, you're going to get the logos again. The feature only works once you've actually started the game, because basically what you're selecting from the OS level is continue game, and it wants to continue from whatever save you were using. So once you load a save game and play it, if you quit after that, and then you continue the game from the PS5 OS, it will jump right into the game as it always did without any company logos. So that works exactly the same as it always did, which is nice.
Okay. So we got a question here from the Phantom Naught. With the Final Fantasy 16 patch having a motion blur slider instead of a simple on-off switch, it seems like a win for everyone. Those who don't like it can have it off. Others who want a bit can fine-tune the amounts they prefer. And the maniacs, that apparently that's you, John, can go all out on full. Should this be the way forward for engines and games to have, instead of a binary switch where it's just having no motion blur or whatever max amount is when enabled? So Alex, this is kind of like something that's been sort of standard on PC settings.
Yeah, and I still think it actually needs to be better on PC. So I say this is like a half step. The full step direction is actually offering more control than that. When we did talk with Crytek about Crysis 2 and Crysis 3 on PC, we advised them, since CryEngine has the ability to do it, to add in options that separate camera and per object motion blur and their strength, so you can turn off camera motion blur, which is, I think, actually the entire reason people don't like motion blur. And it's a very sensible reason too, like, because if you're concentrating on your eyes in a certain part of the screen and you move the camera, it'll blur that area over because there's no eye tracking or anything like that. It is not actually mimicking your eyes. It's mimicking a standard camera at that point in time, which is positive for translation movements in the Z direction, as in going forward and backwards like in a car game, because it gives you that sense of speed and you're not even looking at that part of the screen. But it is not good for anything at that part where it's the middle part where your eyes are looking. Rotational stuff, and or just like a normal camera pan.
Yeah.
It could also be just like that. But so that's the one thing, and I think developers need to do better, and it is actually totally possible within motion blur code itself. It's just a lot of developers don't think about it in this direction, and they don't think about adding it as an option. So I'd say the best option actually in the future is camera motion blur slider and a per object motion blur slider. And actually another thing that I've thought about since I made that motion blur video in 2018 was in the game Halo Reach, I actually used it as a kind of bad example of motion blur in that video because of its low amount of samples for its motion blur.
Yeah.
But what it did was very interesting was essentially they masked out the middle of the screen. So it was like, let's say there's like 75% of the screen in the middle as like an oval was masked out, and motion blur could only apply on camera rotations towards the edges of the screen, interestingly enough. So if you do a full turn like this in that game, the middle of the screen, that part that your eyes probably are going to be looking at, actually stays razor sharp, while the edges do the blur in like a really cool faded out way. And that actually I think would eliminate a lot of people's complaints about motion blur in general, even for camera motion blur. So I think there's a lot of ways to look at this. The only thing is that developers, once in time, if you're just using a standard engine and you're just thinking about it from a cinematic perspective, you don't think about people playing your game. You're thinking about how cool it looks when you're watching a video. You don't think about people playing it. So that's a big difference. I hope developers do that.
That was always the approach that Criterion used with Burnout. Once they implemented that nice motion blur, is they would kind of mask off the center, and then you just have it around the edges, which gives you that awesome sense of speed, but you always have a razor sharp focus right in the middle of the screen, which worked really well. And then separating it out I think is a good idea. I think Call of Duty does that as well, the recent games where you can
World and Gun motion blur.
World and Gun motion blur is separate, because you do want that sweet motion blur on the weapons. I think it looks awesome, but not everybody wants that on the rest of the camera movement, so being able to split that out is awesome. So they could definitely have done even better here, but I think this mostly would solve the problem for Final Fantasy 16 at least, and allow people to sort of dial it into what they want. You can still enjoy motion blur, but you don't have to have that default intensity, which
So John, do you think this is something that maybe should have been picked up in focus group testing? I mean, it's kind of, the sheer reaction to it was so.
So that's a tricky one, because that also brings into mind like the developer intent. Like, I'm not gonna lie, if I had been in charge of this aspect of the game, I kind of would have just initially at least said, "This is what I want. You're not changing it." But that's not really the best attitude in this case, just because I think it looks so good, but. I suspect that they just felt that the game looked so much better with the motion blur, and they didn't consider that not the sort of like non-artistic reasons, which, relates to things like motion sickness and how people focus their eyes. There's a lot of differences there. I think once you actually do sit down and study that, you see that, okay, even if you think it looks good, you got to make concessions for a wider audience. That's the smart thing to do. And I am a little bit surprised that got through for that reason, which makes me wonder about who was testing it and the type of feedback that the team took on board. Maybe they did get the feedback and just didn't want to do it. Maybe they didn't get the feedback. It's tough to say.